I just asked him, I said, of all the mosaics you've excavated, what do you think is the most significant? And he said this one. And he said this one, not because it has the most beautiful decorations or was the most elaborate, but because of its significance for even rewriting history.
Hello, Bible lovers. Welcome to Unscrolled, the podcast about and around the most important, most impactful book in the world. We're here on the fifth floor of Museum of the Bible. For those of you who watch us on YouTube, behind us is the Megiddo Mosaic, the floor of the oldest church known to mankind. Don't want to give too much away, but we're talking today with our guest, one of, I would say, the top 2 or 3 people to talk about this very, very unique exhibit, Dr. Robert Duke. Welcome, Bobby.
Thank you, Matthias.
Bobby, you just came back, I think, just a couple of weeks ago from Israel to see where basically the hole is, where we took this mosaic from. How was that?
Yeah, no, it was exciting to actually be at the location where the mosaic was taken out from and to see it now that we know it's here and it's been restored, but to go to the place where it was really providentially discovered when they were doing some renovations at the Megiddo prison.
So before we get into the museum, you're traveling quite a bit, right? You're kind of, where's home right now? Is it what would you say? Because you lived for a long time in California, now here in Virginia, right?
Yeah, so I taught for 18 years at Azusa Pacific University. My background is archaeology, Dead Sea Scrolls. I've lived in Israel for more than 3 years. Met my wife there, so it is definitely a place that is very dear to my heart. So even anytime I get to go back, even if it for this trip was only for, it was less than a week, for 6 days, it's always a treat to go back. But this was a different type of trip because I was doing archaeology, was seeing where the Megiddo Mosaic was found, and met with our friends at the Israel Antiquities Authority that we call the IAA. But I was also there to connect with communities that were tragically affected by the October 7th events. So it was one where it had not just kind of ancient history, but also modern history that was playing out right before our eyes, seeing some of the places of destruction.
Yeah, it seemed probably natural to us, but how does the Jewish community react to people from the U.S. and Christians coming over and visiting you? I think it's super welcoming now, right?
No, right now it is a time when anyone who can go to Israel and visit, please do, because I know they love to see the support that we can give, and it is a place that is so meaningful to so many people, but it has the just ups and downs of modern world history and just the modern tragedies that we've been witnessing.
So the term Megiddo, or the place Megiddo, maybe before we go into the mosaic, can give a little bit of a context of where that is, where this place is found, kind of a summary of the Megiddo mosaic and its origin.
Right. So many people, even people who are listening to this podcast, may be familiar with what's called Tel Megiddo. A tell is an archaeological site, and the site of Tel Megiddo is actually about a mile north of where this mosaic was found. The tell was very, very important during the Iron Age, during the time of the biblical kings. So kings like Ahab and Solomon and others were there at the site of Tel Megiddo. So just so everyone is clear, this mosaic was not found at the tell, but it was found in the Megiddo prison, which is part of the modern Megiddo Regional Council. They have like counties in Israel, and this is the Regional Council of Megiddo, and it's right there at the Megiddo Junction, which is the junction between 2 major highways in Israel. So it makes a lot of sense that we call it the Megiddo Mosaic, even though it wasn't found at Tel Megiddo that we think when it comes to Old Testament history.
So Megiddo is, I think, about, was it 60 miles south west of Nazareth, right?
No, it's kind of less than that. It's probably about an hour and a half by car north of Jerusalem, and probably about 45 minutes or so from the Sea of Galilee, because the state of Israel is quite small. It's the size of New Jersey. So to get from one side to another is you can do it fairly quickly. So even the day a couple weeks ago that I got to see the site in the prison where this was excavated, I was picked up in Jerusalem, and then within a couple hours we were already inside the prison at the site, and it was truly amazing to be there.
So you mentioned the prison. I think we need, because we've been dealing with this for quite some time. Some of it seems obvious to us, but it's quite unique, the story how this mosaic was discovered. Can you explain that real quick?
So
Not very quick.
real quick. No, it sounds good. So in Israel, whenever you do any kind of construction projects, whether it's building at your apartment complex or building somewhere commercially or even laying a road, they first make sure that we're not covering up anything that will now be covered up for maybe decades, if not generations, based on the building that's there. So they will do salvage archaeology. They will go into a site and make sure that nothing's going to get covered up. So they had set aside a certain amount of time to do this salvage archaeology. And as kind of fate would have it, they were on their last day of what they were going to dig before they gave the green light for the construction project.
So they wanted to expand the prison.
Correct.
Dug, and then they found
And
this
they
was
found this on the last day of the dig, and therefore it became not the last day, because then they had to then excavate the whole floor. And particularly when they found the 3 inscriptions on here, this was something that became very much more important than any construction project that might have been conceptualized to make sure this was unearthed in this pre-construction excavation.
Yeah, I heard from some people that people are actually afraid to find anything in their backyard because then the authorities shut down the backyard and they can't use it for a long time. So they rather put it in a jar or whatever else on their fireplace and keep it there for whenever they need to bring it to the right people. Right? Is that right?
Well, and I would say that there's definitely this one that, I mean, in the state of Israel, everyone realizes the shared treasures you have with anything archaeological. But it is one where
Anywhere you dig, you can find a treasure.
Anywhere you can dig, you can find a treasure. And here was definitely, when it comes to treasures, particularly for understanding the early church, this one's now hard to beat.
So when they found this, they dug, big shovels coming in, they find this. Well, what's the process? How does this work? Do they just bring out the brooms and shovels and until they find out what it is, or how does that work?
Yeah, so it is a very scientific process, and they have a very structured way of doing it. So they set out 5 meter by 5 meter squares, and they dig down very methodically to make sure nothing gets lost, because they want to also capture everything that can be discovered. Because in an excavation like this, you're not just getting to the actual item that, like we see behind us, but you want to capture any of the data that might be sitting on top of that item, like ceramics and pottery, coins. Anything else in other excavations are also looking for any kind of organics like date pits or olive pits, anything that they can use even to carbon date. But here,
So that's to determine the age of
correct,
the artifact.
correct. And for here, it was ceramic pottery that was found. It was the coinage that was found, and even the way the letters are written in the inscriptions that we'll talk about in a minute to give this very confident date of the 3rd century. So this is 100 years before the time of Constantine the Great. This is 100 years before the Nicene Creed. This was in a time when some think that the church didn't have a lot of stability and organization, but we see a very structured community here, one that included people from all walks of life.
So nobody expected this to be there. And out of surprise, it turns out to be, you explain, give it the right term, but the floor of the oldest church known to mankind. That's
Correct.
basically what it is.
Correct.
Right?
So archaeologically, there probably might be more discoveries in the future that would actually have earlier church and kind of house churches. But this one to date is the earliest one ever been discovered in the Holy Land and anywhere. And again, it is hundreds of years before we have what we think of as church architecture. So even parts of this building don't have that basilica concept. And even our friends with the Israel Antiquities Authority, in our conversations back and forth, they wanted to use terms like a prayer hall or a house church because it didn't have those features they were looking for, like being oriented east-west, having aisles, having a baptistry, and all those things that were true of later churches. But it really got to the heart of, is a church a gathering of people who believe in Jesus, or is a church an architectural feature? And the word is used both ways.
So before we get into the contents of the mosaic, so when you find something like this, I think it was in 2006. So when
2004 was when it was first time
2004.
covered.
2025.
Correct.
So people can do their math, over 20 years to get here. Why does that take so long?
Yeah. So for this one particularly, it was uncovered inside a maximum security active prison. They wanted to make sure that when they removed it, they could restore it, that it could be exhibited, because the goal is to eventually have it be exhibited around the world, maybe for 5 or 10 years, and then eventually placed back somewhere in that general area as a place where tourists can come see it close to where it was discovered. But in archaeological time, things can move slowly. And here was a good example where once they discovered it, they had done some preliminary reports, but then they covered it back up until kind of an opportune time. And again, when they reached out to the museum and we had various conversations, it was deemed that it was one with some of the support from the museum that we could remove it from the ground, restore it, because it looks beautifully level and flat now, but it actually had dips and holes because of critters eating underneath the soil or erosion. So it had to be restored in some of the IAA galleries outside of Jerusalem, or their workshops, and then it had to be transported here. So once it got here, it had to be restitched back together. And it really was one where they just were waiting for the right time to remove it so they can start touring it around the world.
So you find this mosaic, 20 by 30 feet. It has all these waves and curves in there, and parts intact, parts broken up. How do you get that out of the ground? Explain that to the lay person.
Yeah, so for this one particularly, and it worked well that even the designs on the mosaic are very rectangular in structure. So they cut rectangle sections, and over 10 of them, those sections that then were taken, restored, and then restored in a way that they could then stitch them back together like a puzzle. But in order so that any of the designs on the mosaic weren't damaged, because they didn't want to cut right through, say, the fish medallion or cut through right through one of the inscriptions, they excavated it and cut it into rectangles that would retain integrity with those different features.
So I heard in order to get it out of the ground, they basically put, I think, a sticky fabric on top and then chiseled off the bottom of those flat mosaic stones, lifted it up, turned it around, and polished each and every one. How many is it? 200 and
It's hundreds of thousands of stones that are in there.
so that's how they did it,
Right.
and that's why it took so long, because they had to basically chisel off every single piece of those 20 by 30 feet mosaic.
Yeah, and then they brought it back together, and even the conservators from the Israel Antiquities Authority came here, and when they put it back together, it was just fascinating to watch because they stitched it back together with kind of period right stones so that it comes back together. But we had to get those crates in this gallery, flying from Tel Aviv to Belgium to JFK, and then trucked down to here. And there was one moment of nervousness when we had to get the largest crate inside the gallery door, and we had about an inch on each side to bring that case inside the door.
Crazy. Now that we know how it got here, we said it was dated back to 230 AD. We have 2025, so there's 1800 years between it being discovered and now, or it being used and now being here at the museum. What happened in those 1800 years? Why did nobody know that it was there?
Right. Well, it was intentionally covered up by the original occupants of this building. We don't know exactly what was there some kind of persecution, was there a famine, was there some reason they needed to relocate, but they covered it in a way that it kept its integrity as much as possible over 1800 years. And it was good that they did that, because if they had just abandoned the building, it probably would have fallen away in history. It probably would have just through erosion and weathering, it would have been gone. But during those 1800 years, I mean, the church grew around the world, but we're able to see this first church ever discovered archaeology, and it gives you really some chills to think about the fact that you're standing here. And for me as a Christian to stand here and go, I am standing in a place where my fellow members of the Christian faith stood 1800 years ago and worshiped Jesus Christ.
1800 years. Why did they cover it up? Well, what's the reason then? Or maybe first, how was it used? It was 230 Romans in the Holy Land. You wouldn't think of a church, right? So what started? Well, what do we know about how the place was being used?
Yeah, well, in archaeology, you have to take whatever data you can find. So for here, we have a table right in the middle of the floor. We then have 3 inscriptions around. And when you look at all that data, and particularly the fish medallion that's right in the middle of this largest carpet, it kind of stitches together this picture of this early Christian community that was made up of people from very different walks of life. Um, so the 3 inscriptions, and we'll go into each one of them more specifically, but one of them mentions a centurion. One of them mentions the mosaic artist. One of them mentions a woman who was a philanthropist who gave money to have the table in the center of the room that I think convincingly was used for the Eucharist, was used for communion. Um, What we don't have in this room is a baptistry. Later churches and basilicas, they would have full-on baptistries built right in the church, but we're here at a time when they probably just use natural sources of water in and around this area when they were going to have any kind of baptismals. So it was a moment that you get a sense of what church was like. It isn't a huge building, so we don't get a sense that this is a place where hundreds and hundreds of people came. This is a small group of people, but in that small group of people, just from the data on the mosaic, we see people of power, we see work people, we see men and women all interacting together in this room.
So one more question before we go to the contents of it. We said that it's 230. Christians using it. What's the context? Where was this building located? We spoke about the geography, but the immediate place was a part of a city. Where exactly was it?
So it was close to the Roman legion called Legio. This was a major junction going north and south there in the Holy Land, and there was a Roman garrison. There was a whole Roman kind of unit that was stationed at this location. And again, anytime you have a military installation, and this is still true today, whether you're in Europe or in the United States, you can have other items come around and whole other commercial industries coming around that site because you have to have food and clothing and everything else. So this became a site where people, not just Romans, but also Jews, Samaritans, Christians of various backgrounds, lived in this area around that Roman legion that was right there, just kind of southwest of the Sea of Galilee.
So this church structure, this building, was in a Roman camp.
It was connected to the Roman camp. So the Roman camp was an isolated item just a little bit away from that, but this was all the area around. And the actual village that was here was called Capharos Nai. It was a little village connected to this Roman camp, but it was within very, very close walking distance, just hundreds of yards to where the actual Roman camp was located.
So every soldier in this camp must have known this existed. And what we know of persecution of Christians and this time frame, quite unusual to see a church in or attached to a Roman camp, right?
So even during, excuse me, the Roman Empire, I mean, you had it vacillate back and forth between times of peace and times of persecution. So there was at least a season here where this was fairly, I mean, it wasn't hidden. It would have been known in some way. So this wasn't like in the catacombs hidden somewhere. I mean, it was in a building that was well established and even had the time to have a very wonderful mosaic floor built for it. But there, again, in the kind of vacillating of realities, there must have come a point where they abandoned it for some reason, and probably some kind of persecution is the best guess.
Emperor who was more hostile to Christians.
Correct.
Okay, so let's dive into the contents of the mosaic. 20 by 30 feet, there's different modules in there. Maybe we start with the inscriptions. There's how many total? Two.
We have three inscriptions. And if I can, I would actually like to start with the fish medallion right in the middle of the large carpet.
You determine the pace.
Because I think that sets up very well the fact that this is a Christian building. With then what we're talking about the inscriptions. But the fish symbol was the earliest symbol for Christianity before the cross became the symbol. The cross wasn't always the symbol of Christianity. That really came after the time of, say, Constantine and later on. And today when we see a cross, whether it be a crucifix with Jesus on the cross or one without, it's a Christian symbol. It's called the red cross. It's not called the red fish. But the fish, earlier centuries before Constantine, was the symbol for Christianity for several reasons. The disciples are called to be fishers of men. You have the feeding of the 5,000 with the fish kind of being a central piece to that miracle. But then the phrase, Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, the first letter of each of those words, when you put them together, it becomes an acronym that is ichthus, which is the word for fish in Greek. So the fish then was a symbol. So even the fact that the only kind of animated item in this whole, everything else is geometric, but that one animated item, a fish, kind of already leans it toward a Christian use for this building. Then when we start moving to the different inscriptions, it starts unpacking it even more that this was definitely the earliest church and it was used by Christians. And if I can just start walking through the inscriptions, we can do that.
For those of you who want to follow what Bobby's talking about right now, you can do that on museumofthebible.org/Megiddo. There's the pictures of what Bobby is describing right now.
So the largest inscription just by space on it is, it mentions Gaianus, who was a centurion and our brother. So it has those two ways to reference Gaianus as being a centurion, a Roman military powerhouse, but also being our brother. Now, people have debated whether or not that term our brother was being more just generic, or was it being used like you have in the letters in the New Testament, where the Apostle Paul, like to the brothers in the church of Philippi, or to the brothers in the church of fill in the blank. And I think in light of everything else in this building, I think it is saying that he was a person of faith. He was a Christian that was part of this community. And then it talks about him being the one who gave of his generosity to help build this mosaic floor. In the very bottom of that inscription, it actually mentions the mosaic artist Brudius. And it says Brudius was the one who made this floor. And when I think of that, you have Gaianus, a person of power, the Roman centurion in this area, being mentioned with the mosaic artisan. We don't know exactly what caused the mosaic artisan to be mentioned, but I have this kind of romantic idea that Gaianus came into this building and said, yes, I may have been the one that supplied the funds, but this is the one who did it. But again, a workman and a centurion mentioned on the same inscription. Over here to the behind me is the inscription that mentions 4 women. It just says, may these 4 women be remembered, and it lists their names. We don't know why they're being remembered. Are they being remembered because they were martyrs? Are they being remembered because they were philanthropists that gave to this room? Are they being remembered for something else they did, good deeds in their lives? But it has 4 women that are mentioned that by name. So we have 2 men now and 4 women. But the farthest inscription, farthest behind me, mentions a woman named Akeptis. It calls her a lover of God, and it gives her that title. But then it says she should be honored for giving of the table in the room, of which we see the table base, to the God Jesus Christ. All those pieces together, a Roman centurion being called our brother, women being remembered using the same words and phrases that we see in the New Testament for like Mary being remembered for anointing Jesus' feet. The same word being used in Greek is, may she be remembered for this act of kindness to Jesus. Well, these women are being remembered using that same Greek word. And then we have this mention of the table to the God Jesus Christ. So that table would have definitely been used for the Eucharist right in the center of the room, and framed this whole room as being a place where you had 30 or 40, we don't know, it's the room is not huge, but maybe 30 or 40 people on a regular basis gathering in this room for Christian worship.
So there's multiple unusual things that we probably need to unpack. The centurion first. A centurion being mentioned on the Christian mosaic or Christian church mosaic in the 3rd century. That is highly unusual, or is that? That's not been common, right?
Well, what is interesting, when you read the Gospels, you do see that there were military connected people in the Roman Empire, and even centurions at times, that were attracted to the message of Jesus. You even have at the cross, in the cross narratives of one of the centurions, like, surely this is the Son of God, just because of everything that happened there. But we have this concept that these Roman military officers, probably during times of peace, may have had this free time to think about life outside of pagan Rome, and like, what is the truth? I mean, think of Pontius Pilate saying, like, well, who knows the truth? Well, we at least have a centurion named Gaianus who seems to have pursued that truth and was part of this community here and was called our brother.
And the second unusual piece is 4 women, or 5 women,
Right.
actually mentioned on the mosaic. That is unusual for an ancient mosaic, correct?
Well, I would say the early Christian church, one of the things that was a signature is that they elevated women in ways the Roman Empire didn't. In the Roman Empire, women did not have the rights that you see women having and playing in the early church. The early church, we saw the elevation of women in wonderful ways, and this room represents that. We have women being mentioned right along the centurion. We have women being recognized for their philanthropic activities. You have a woman who gave the table for the Eucharist and for communion right in the middle of the room. So we have this beautiful picture of what you see even in the writings of the Apostle Paul. Of here there is no Greek or Jew, slave or free, male or female, but we're all one in Christ. And that is just depicted beautifully on this mosaic floor.
Cool reminder of how countercultural Christian faith was at the time, right? The most outstanding reference in the mosaics, in the inscriptions of the mosaic, is probably the one that refers to Christ being God, the deity of Christ, and it's the first time this is mentioned outside of the Bible. Is that correct?
So even one of the conservators who was part of the reconstruction here, I had the chance to go to a Washington Nationals baseball game with him, and we were just small talking, and he has excavated many mosaics around the Holy Land. And I just asked him, I said, of all the mosaics you've excavated, what do you think is the most significant? And he said this one. And he said this one, not because it has the most beautiful decorations or was the most elaborate, but because of its significance for even rewriting history. There is the notion out there that in some ways the early church, before you get to the time of Constantine and the Council of Nicaea and all those, and it was kind of the wild, wild west of theology and everything else. But this room itself, our earliest church ever discovered, has very orthodox Christian theology. And again, this mosaic floor will have to be referenced by all church historians going forward as a huge data point, because they're always looking for concrete primary sources when it comes to what was life actually like. And there's no better primary source than what we see on this floor.
Yeah, it was funny. I remember coming. You mentioned Mark, who was one of the excavators, one of the archaeologists here. And after the game, he called me, Matthias. Matthias, you need to see this. This is talking about Jesus being God. And I was thinking, here's this Jewish archaeologist telling me the Baptist boy that Jesus is God. So there's no. I think even they understand the uniqueness of this find,
Yeah.
right?
And I would say even one of the things I've loved so much about this project too is it brings people together that their paths and their lives probably wouldn't have crossed in any other way than with us having a common exhibit like this. So even Mark was telling me of his background, having actually been, before he immigrated from Russia to Israel, having served in the Russian army, then in the Israel army, and now being a conservator who is known around the world for the work he does.
Wow. So, looking at this mosaic, what are the things that we kind of take away from the mosaic? What are the things that we're learning from it?
Yeah, I would say without a doubt having a primary source, a mosaic floor from a church in the 3rd century, predates all other churches that we know archaeologically by 100 years when it comes to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. I mean, takes us a step back and gives us a window into that era. I mentioned, I've been mentioning to various people when I've given them on a tour here, as I said, you do have the table for the Eucharist, but we don't have any baptism. Well, this was still a time when they used natural sources of water, which actually is one step removed from the Gospels where they used natural sources of water. They didn't have nice baptistry. So, I mean, all of us who go to churches where they have a nice built-in baptistry somewhere, well, that was something that came later. That was not even part of the early church. It was one where they went out to the seashores, they went out to the lakes, and they would have these moments of baptism. And that must have been true of this building too, because there was no baptistry found. Um, I would say there's so many other things that just can be unpacked. I think it's just beautiful that you have this whole array of people being mentioned that, again, were not for their common faith. They probably would have never interacted on a regular basis, but all of a sudden you have the Gaianas and the Keptus and these people interacting around the Eucharist.
So, the church bridging gender differences, bridging um, um, hierarchical differences. It's something that's very unique. What we learn about how the church kind of grew up during that time, and if we know, I like to say, if the Book of Acts was continued, it ends pretty abruptly after chapter 28, right? So if we had continued, Luke had continued writing, this would have probably been one of the sites that he spoke about, right?
No, absolutely. And again, it would be fantastic if we had some ancient source that mentioned some early church Christian pilgrim coming into the church of Megiddo. I mean, we don't have that. But maybe someday. Maybe someday we'll unearth something where a pilgrim in those first few centuries talks about worshiping with the believers in Megiddo. Until then, we can just use our imagination of what it was like. And by using our imagination, even as part of this exhibit, we have also found from that same time period the earliest church hymn. One of the things we highlight in this gallery is a hymn that was found on papyrus in Egypt from the same time period that actually has musical notations. And that's one too of just using our imagination. What was music like here? What was the Eucharist like? What was preaching like? We don't really know because we don't have any recordings, but it's still exciting to think 1,800 years later, churches are still coming together every week to the honor of the God Jesus Christ.
So you used the term imagination as a scholar. So how do you deal with that term? How much imagination do you allow yourself to build this out, not to kind of expand the interpretation of what you find here too much?
Well, I would say even in archaeology, there's a kind of a spectrum of how much you say reconstruct versus how much you just leave the stones as they are without doing much interpretation. And I would say that there are, say, even whole archaeological places that have been discovered where they've now gone back and rebuilt the buildings with a very clear kind of line of, like, below here is what was actually discovered and above it is what we have reconstructed. So there is precedent for us kind of reconstructing some things in our minds and filling it in with other evidence. I think without a doubt, the fact that 100 years later we have something like the Nicene Creed that has this high Christology of Jesus being God, that ties in perfectly with what we see on this mosaic floor. So we get this sense of
that it wasn't just defined then, but
right.
It was a common understanding.
There was a common thread from the time of the Gospels all the way to the Nicene Creed that comes through Megiddo.
At the museum, we talk about transformation, not just the transfer of information, but transformation. What would you describe as kind of the transformational aspect of this find, whether it's the story of its discovery, you know, what you learned about it, or people can take away from it? What would you say that is?
Yeah. Well, as someone who I spent most of my scholarly career doing Dead Sea Scrolls, I would say I got the same kind of goosebumps when I read this story as the first time I got to go inside K4 at Qumran. This whole thought that we are peering into
K4, one of the caves.
One of the caves there at Qumran. Like, to go into that and realize this was the cave where most of the biblical text, our earliest biblical text, were hidden for thousands of years and we've rediscovered. I mean, here again, you have this treasure that was hidden for 1,800 years and was rediscovered in 2004 and now on exhibit around the world here in 2025.
Yeah, and it's amazing when you stand here and see people come through, you know, people say, is this the real thing? We have to say it is. And sometimes, you know, when the people who were working on the mosaic, they were actually walking on it, and people say, how can you do this? It's 1800, but there's a floor. People actually would walk on the floor. But it's amazing to see people, how emotionally they reacted, to realize 1,800 years ago, people believed the same thing that we still believe today, and there's a history that goes beyond generations, over centuries, that connects me with the people of the early church. I think it's something different than just reading it in a book, but seeing it come alive in this mosaic.
Oh, absolutely, and particularly for most of our guests that North American, I mean, 250 years ago, we're coming up on the 250th anniversary of our country. I mean, that's only 250 years ago. We're going back 1,800 years. So that gives you a sense of really how young even we are as a country and everything here in North America. But this goes back and gives us a window that goes back so many years, in that sense that the theology is the same. And there it is, to the worship of the God Jesus Christ.
So there's obviously many stunning mosaics, archaic mosaics that were discovered over the years. Where would you rank this, or maybe not? You know, I don't want to ask LeBron or Jordan, but I want to ask a question: where does this rank properly in the comparison to all the archaeological finds of mosaics specifically?
Well, there are definitely mosaics that are more artistic. There's this one in a place called Sepphoris in Israel that they call it the Mona Lisa of the Galilee, because this mosaic picture of this young woman is stunning. It looks like a painting rather than a mosaic floor. So
Where's that?
art is in a place called Sepphoris. In Hebrew, they call it Tzipori. It is truly a stunning mosaic when it comes artistically. But nothing to the caliber of the theology that's here when it comes to really a window into the early church. This is one that is a game changer when it comes to our understanding of those first couple centuries. So is it my favorite mosaic? Absolutely. I think it should be everybody's favorite mosaic, but I just,
Especially from your perspective of substance.
yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's just a privilege to be here at Museum of the Bible and to be the first place in the world this has ever been exhibited. The last time this floor was seen was 1,800 years ago, when the community there decided they needed to abandon the building, rediscovered in 2004, removed last March, just March of 2024. It was still in the ground and removed, and now here on display in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's pretty special. Well, there's two ways to discover this museum, to explore it. The best one, obviously, is to come to Washington, D.C. and see it here until
July 6th.
July 6th. That's how much time is left. And short of that, there's a documentary that was just finished that we worked together with a studio called Evolve, and it's streaming on Angel Studios. So if you go to angel.com/MOTB, you will be able to watch the documentary of the story that Bobby just described to us, how this mosaic was discovered, its significance, lots of interviews and background stories, far more that we could cover here in the few minutes that we had. So invite you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Bobby, thank you for being
Thank
here.
you. I can
And,
talk about this all day. So
Yeah, we'll probably do another episode, maybe bring the folks from Evolve here and
That'd be
talk a
great.
little bit about the stories around the documentary that we filmed. So thank you, everybody, and see you next time at Unscrolled.